So that was a brilliant introduction to our panel session from those first two presentations. It's almost as if we planned it that way. But thank you to the presenters. That was wonderful. And I mean, a key message there, I think, is that DNA data storage is here. That's really exciting. I mean, maybe qualify that slightly. It's just around the corner, okay? It's got a little bit cheaper, you know, but it's here, it's working. It worked for you, and those checksums checked out, which is really exciting for us. You know, we're at iPres, okay? Everyone here, I'm going to get controversial straight away, everyone here is a technologist, okay? Even if it's just a little bit, we're all technologists, right? And this is tremendously exciting. And it's very easy to get carried away because we've got this new toy to play with, right? So what we thought we'd do with this panel session is dig into whether DNA data storage can actually work practically for the digital preservation community. Will it meet with our requirements? Do we need to rethink the way that we do digital preservation because of this new opportunity, perhaps this new challenge coming along for us? So we've brought together a diverse range of viewpoints, of skill sets and expertise to dig into some of those issues in a bit more detail. So Euan was just starting to touch on that when he was running out of time. So we hopefully will have opportunity to dig into that a little bit more. Can DNA data storage work for us? So you've already met Pierre-Yves and Euan, so I'll just introduce the other members of our panel. On the far end there, we have Stefan Helmold, who has more than 25 years of industry experience in senior product and technical marketing, business development and sales roles in volatile and non-volatile semiconductor memory, as well as data storage. As the Senior Vice President, Business Development and Data Storage at Twist Bioscience, he is responsible to promote, educate and drive the DNA data storage market evolution. And in the middle, we have Sibyl Schaefer, who is the Chronopolis Program Manager and the Digital Preservation Librarian at the University of California, San Diego. She has almost 2 decades of experience in the libraries and archives and is founding author of the Digital Preservation Storage Criteria. And on the end nearest to me, we have Matthew Addis, who is the CTO of Archivum, has 20 years of experience with storage technologies used for archiving and digital preservation, including founding Archivum, which was originally created to provide new approaches to long-term data storage. That sounds like we've got the right people here. So, it would be great, I've got a few questions lined up for them. It would be great also to involve the audience a little bit more. So if you want to start thinking about some really tricky questions for these guys now, hopefully we'll have time to bring you into the conversation. So without further ado, let's get started. So the first question for the panel is DNA the storage medium that we have been waiting for? What are the challenges and opportunities for turning this technology into a viable solution for the digital preservation community? Who would like to kick us off? Do you want to go there, Matthew?
I'll have a go first. Is DNA storage medium we've been waiting for? Maybe. I think, as we heard, there's a lot of really positive qualities. So density, longevity, some protection against existential threats, long-term TCO, albeit with very high upfront costs, but I think there are some challenges to overcome too. So if I look back on some of the storage technologies that have been used for archiving over the last 20 years, I'll put them into 2 groups. So Plasmon UDO, Sony ODA, Millenniata MDisk, Group 47 Dots, Pickle Film, and there's some others. They've all promised 100 years plus storage, minimal requirements on storage conditions, highest density, fast-ish read-write. None are in widespread use today, or they don't exist at all. So there's been some failure of product or service or market. And that, I think, is the risk or the challenge that DNA storage needs to overcome. On the other hand, storage technologies that have been successful in archiving are things like hard drives and tapes. They're not specialized for archiving. They've got mass market commodity applications, and that makes them sustainable. So large-scale manufacturing, they're really low cost, big economies of scale, lots of competition. So I think if DNA storage is to succeed, then it needs to find its own sort of mass market application that will sustain it beyond the archiving and preservation sector. Now, I think the 2 key things to that are speed and cost, but I'm going to stop now and save that bit for another answer. I'll hand it on to someone else.
Who else would like to come in?
I'll be happy to continue on with that. That was an excellent lead-in comment. So in my prior life, before joining Twist, I was working at Western Digital, and I was looking at all the storage solutions. And I concluded that even if we make all the SSDs and all the hard disk drives and all the tape drives and everything else, it wasn't going to be enough. It wasn't enough from a bit perspective. It would not meet the economic needs. It would not meet the sustainability needs. So the conclusion was we need to add something to the storage pyramid at the bottom, right? Which is also what Daniel talked about. And we need to have something that can complement the storage solutions we have today, but it's tailored for cold storage. And that's really where DNA data storage excels. If you want to retain something for an extended period of time, especially when you have decades or hundreds of years, DNA data storage is ideal because it doesn't require migration. This is really one of the key points that makes it extremely attractive. We've seen another talk that spoke about the reliability of data. The problem is with all of the error modes that you have in today's storage solutions, if you scale that up to zettabytes, right, you'll be very quickly reaching the limits of basically retrieving the data that you wrote to it accurately. That's another problem, right? And then, of course, the other thing that it's correct that DNA has to prove itself with regards to usability. The ecosystem has to be built, but it holds the promise that's the only technology candidate to actually also meet the price points that are an order of magnitude below where cost for storage is today, right? And we have heard it in every talk, right? It's all, at the end of the day, right, it needs to meet certain cost targets, right? If you don't meet those, then everything else goes out the window, right? And I think that is really what holds the promise here overall. And again, don't see this as a replacement, right? But see it as an addition to your toolbox that you're using today, right? Of course, if you access data very frequently, you wouldn't put it on DNA, right? But just to give you an idea, so IARPA has a roadmap for DNA synthesis that is leading to $1 a terabyte by 2030. That's a US government-issued document that's declassified that you can find on the internet if you go and look for it. Just to give you an idea, right, what people are expecting that this technology can deliver.
Does anyone else want to come in on that? This sounds great. What's the catch?
I think the question is interesting. I think maybe DNA storage is the storage medium we didn't know we wanted, but we do. I think in particular, the cost of extra copies is really fascinating to consider. For example, if we're able to, some people have projected that in one of these little capsules, you'll be able to fit a petabyte of data. And even if it's only a terabyte or a few terabytes, imagine if you can make a copy of that for sort of under $20 or less. You could make 100 copies for $2,000. And then what would you do with all those copies? We've never really thought about having that many copies of things. You could give them out to patrons and say, here, take a copy of the library with you. And that could be your super extra backup. So if anything really bad happened, there'd be so many copies, it's highly likely one would survive. I think it kind of disrupts what we would consider. The vault option that Twist are talking about in particular, that offline storage, if we can get the cost of copies down that low, it disrupts the way we think about storage over time.
I would say along with that, some of the things that I've seen with it involve security. So physical security becomes especially important. And then I'm not one of the folks involved in the actual DNA sequencing or whatnot, so I kind of have learned by reading. But it does seem like there is a potentiality for tampering via technologies like CRISPR. And so it's not necessary. It might not necessarily be as secure as one would think. And then with that, how is that detected? Additionally, if your institution requires that you keep your data encrypted at rest, which for certain types of data it's a requirement, even if the preservationists in us would prefer not to have it encrypted, sometimes it has to be encrypted. So how does that work with DNA sequencing, et cetera? So that's one of the challenges that I see with the technology.
Pierre-Yves, do you want to comment?
Yeah, okay. Just will speak about point of view of archivist. I think we spoke a lot of time about exabytes. I think for archivists, as they keep only 1% of information, even a terabyte would be very useful for them. And for that, this is an interesting technology already, well, within a few years, I would say, for terabytes. But the nice thing is that you don't need to care about migration as you would have to do for change of technology like tapes, where every time you have to migrate your data, and this is very costly. It costs a lot of money to migrate, for instance, 1 petabyte. It costs $100,000. And so, at least for that, this is very a great advantage for archivists.
Thanks, guys. We heard a little bit from Stefan there on where this technology might fit. So let's dig into that a little bit more. Can DNA data storage really meet with our needs as digital preservationists? And if it's not possible to have a sort of a one medium fits all, as was hinted at there, where can DNA storage fit into our challenges that are before us? Who wants to lead? Go for it, Sibyl.
So yeah, I agree that as a cold storage technology as part of your preservation strategy, I think it fits really well. And I reviewed the preservation storage criteria, version 4, which we have a lightning talk about in our next session, to see kind of what criteria DNA storage meets and where there may be some gaps. And I was quite excited and impressed by how many of the criteria it does meet. Things like cost efficiency, or we're expecting that down the line, energy efficiency, technical independence, so it's independent from the spinning disks or solid state drives that we're generally, or tape that we're generally currently using. The replication, as Euan was saying, it's fairly easy to replicate thousands of copies. It's one diverse storage media, one of potentially many diverse storage media types. It's durable, there's built-in error control, it has high resilience. It could be one of your multiple storage tiers related to availability, so it would be a cold storage tier, scalable to data size, and easily expandable to your data needs. The areas that I thought were still under investigation and still needed more clarification included things like integrity checking, regular integrity checking, system error reporting, activity monitoring, reporting on the activities that are happening with the storage, content reporting, custom reporting, data error notification, and documented access. So a lot of things around the materials themselves and access to the materials and any type of reporting that you would get from a system that wasn't necessarily cold storage, but was reporting out to you. So those are areas where I imagine things would be a bit different. Maybe the fixity checking wouldn't occur at a regular basis, et cetera. So those would have to be not necessarily reimagined, but I guess re-envisioned for the medium itself.
Thanks, Sibyl. There's a reason we had to have you on this. Who else would like to comment on that?
I'll add one thing to that I think, I agree with all those things. But at the moment, I think DNA storage only works for very small amounts of data. And its ability to scale up is going to depend hugely on increasing the speed of synthesis of writing to storage. So that petabyte that you talked about in that tiny little pot, I think current speeds are something like 1 megabyte a second writing, or thereabouts. A petabyte of data takes 3,000 years at that rate. So unless we can get the speed up, you won't get the volumes, and hence it will have a limited application from that point of view.
Yeah, so when you look at, maybe I can add to that, when you look at performance, right, we certainly can, we need to scale up the density, right? Today we write at megabytes, soon at gigabytes, right? The speed we can solve through parallelism, right? So that's not so much the issue, right? And we'll get from a day scale, right, to probably faster than that. You can hide, believe it or not, but you can hide the write speed to some degree. through staging, right, and accumulation caches, right? What you cannot hide is the read access, right? So that's why we always ask people is, do you understand what's your data access SLA, right? Because that really then determines what classification you need, what's the frequency and speed of access, right? But I think that these problems can be solved as you look into automation, right? And that's going to be another key. Daniel showed a slide, right, of the 4 areas that we need innovation, right? It's next to scaling up synthesis and sequencing. It's the automation, right, as well as the storage.
Any further thoughts on that?
I talked to a competitor of Twist about their technology, which is very similar. And I think both are saying that it's highly dependent on CPU technology. So it's using very similar production lines to create the chips that do the synthesis. So as that gets denser and denser, the density of the DNA that we can store and the cost will go in the same direction. So the cost will go down, we'll be able to store more. So that doesn't seem to be getting slower. It's getting a little slower, the density of CPU, of transistors on a chip, but it's still going down and down, or up and up over time. So it's looking very promising.
And maybe if I can add, clarifying to that. So the reference is the manufacturing process. So what many people may not know, just as a little technical side bit here, is actually DNA data storage is enabled with the most advanced semiconductor technology. We use semiconductor chips to write the DNA, and we will use semiconductor chips to read the DNA. So the most advanced semiconductor technology is what's required to enable that. So when you think about semiconductor scaling, and take NAND flash as an example, right? You paid for, in 1991, a 20 megabyte SSD was $1,000, right? You know how much that costs today, right? So think about that scaling roadmap that semiconductor scaling has delivered for NAND flash, right? That gives you a little bit of an idea, right, what is ahead of us as we're scaling the technology and enabling basically more cost-effective, higher density nodes in the future.
Further thoughts, or should we go to our audience at this point?
Yeah, maybe one problem we didn't discuss is that when you encode the information in DNA, you have to be able to decode it. So you should not lose this information somewhere in the algorithm. And so either it has to be self-described, or you have to store in another place the recipe to understand it within hundreds of years. And this is probably the main difficulty we will face in the future, I would say.
Okay, thanks, guys. Should we move on now? Okay. So it would be great to hear from you guys. Have you got any questions or any questions online? Or already got an online question? Well, the people in the room always get to go first, don't they? We'll change that around. Well, what's the online question?
Well, we've got 2 questions already, but we'll do one and then maybe let the people in the room have a go. So the first one was around threats to DNA storage. So we've heard a little bit about that from Sibyl already in terms of security. So the question is, threats for current storage are understood. Could you discuss the threats for DNA storage and possible mitigation measures to manage those risks?
Who wants to take that?
I'll be happy to jump in. So the enemy of DNA is oxidation, right? That you need to keep that away from the DNA. That's when you think about the DNA samples that have been preserved for tens of thousands of years, right? They were all encapsulated, right? They were stored in a very safe environment for the DNA, right? So that's what you want to avoid, right? And then, as we know, light, right, is also to some degree a potential enemy, right? And excessive temperature, right? So don't throw it in a volcano, right? That will not work, right? And that's why when you go down that threat list, right, and you look into that also, let's say tape storage as an example, right? That's why this DNA shell was created, because it defends against these threat mechanisms, right? There's no light that comes into this capsule, right? It's laser welded sealed. There's an inert gas in it, right, that makes sure that there is no oxygen or water or any other exposure to it. And for the most part, it is temperature safe. Again, don't throw it in your fireplace or oven, right? That may be counterproductive, right? And don't run it over with a tank, right? That would destroy the physical integrity. But I think those threat scenarios would also threaten all of your other preservation storage technologies that you're deploying today, right? So I'd say it's pretty rugged.
I can add, in Switzerland, we developed a technology based on nanobits of silicium around DNA, and they made tests and they evaluate at 1,000 years the half-life time of this technology. So we have solution.
Mm-hmm. Nature shows it's a robust technology. I mean, they've dug up seeds from the permafrost that have been like 30,000 years old, and the things still germinate.
Yeah.
Right? So I think from a storage point of view and a robustness point of view, it's just fantastic.
Yeah.
And beyond that, I mean, it's just the same as any other technology, right? It's encoding data, encrypting it maybe, multiple copies, different locations, and so on.
Yeah.
So it's business as usual, I think, from that point of view.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, guys. We had a question in the room?
Yeah, it's kind of in the similar vein as the previous question. And sorry for being a sour pass coming with ideas that it could not work. But I was wondering about the DNA and when you enclose it in those capsules, do you also need to make sure that there aren't any other stuff in there, like viruses or something that could destroy the DNA or eat it up in a sense?
Well, I'll be happy to take a stab at that. First of all, the DNA is dehydrated, right? And then again, keep in mind that we write the DNA synthetically, right, in a clean room environment. And then it's basically dehydrated and enclosed in this capsule, right? From that perspective, I'd say, while you never can completely rule out that you don't have any airborne viruses somewhere, right, unless you have a super clean room, right? For the most part, right, you can assume that there's a clean environment for the data. And then again, it's synthetic DNA that we write, right? So we are checking for, as Daniel mentioned, we're checking for sequences that are unfavorable from a reliability as well as from a threat perspective, right? So if you were to try and send us a sequence and say, go write me that DNA, we won't ship you anything back that is hazardous, right? We just won't do that, right? And so that's part of the process in that you check for the actual data sequence, that it doesn't yield you anything that's harmful.
Any further thoughts? Any more questions from the crowd? Lots of questions, right.
Pardon me if I misunderstood this, but if DNA isn't additive, isn't there an artificial or a limit on the amount of space that you could use? So you say that it's it can contain 40 zettabytes of data, but if you're only utilizing 16 megabits of data and you can't add anything onto it, doesn't the 40 zettabytes kind of go to waste?
That's an excellent question. So part of, as Daniel mentioned, is DNA data storage is like a software-defined media. So you can, this capsule here, right, you can put, I always say close to half an exabyte, about close to 500 petabytes, theoretically, right? But you can also just put a megabyte in it, right? And the only reason why this is right now in certain increments is to make things easy, right? Can we just deploy methodologies to modify DNA, right, and all of that, the tools that were mentioned? Yes, you can, right, but that makes things complicated. And first, the objective is you go make it work, right? Make it work cost-effective at the right density, and then we can introduce other features to it, right? There are lots of possibilities, right, with regards to DNA for modification, right, and appending. But I think for purposes of data storage, you want to keep it at this point simple. It's already difficult enough for us to establish this entire ecosystem. So this all works seamless, plug and play, right? And we deliver on the promise that Daniel mentioned, that nobody has to change, right, what they're doing today. right? Because there will be, of course, some changes that will come, right, into it, the fore, which is, for example, and it was brought on before as well, there was a lot of discussion about fixity checks, right? So one of the things that's going to be ahead of us for general storage media as well as also for DNA data storage is, how does fixity check look like if you have now not a terabyte, a petabyte, but now you get an exabyte of data under management? I encourage you to read the specs for the underlying storage you use. Like a disk drive writes and reads at about 100 megabyte. And you can do the math on, if you run annual fixity checks, right, when this is going to break. Right? This is part of the problem, that we have to reinvent how we make sure that that the data integrity is assured. And we need to put massive safeguards on top of the actual data storage, right, to make sure that even if we have a high error rate, right, we still for sure will be able to safely regain the original data, right?
So my impression is that it's not like you have a petabyte Isilon that, you know, if you only store 40 megabytes on it, you're wasting the rest of the space. It prints just what you need.
Yeah.
So it's not like there's additional space that you need to use up. You just have that 40 megabytes and then you can print more.
Which is the problem that almost all of us have at the moment when we buy our storage and then go, oh no, we're not ready to put the data in.
Yeah. You're always buying for the headroom, right? Yes.
But there is a difference in terms of deletion or changing. So if you have written a large amount of data and you want to, and it's all mixed up in one of those little capsules, and you want to go in and you want to delete a little bit of it, then you essentially have to throw the whole lot away and rewrite it all, except for the thing that you wanted to get rid of. So I think there is a little bit of a change in the way that we need to deal with large volumes of data when we get to the scale that DNA storage promises.
So you brought that in very matter-of-factly, Matthew, but I mean, this is a growing big requirement for us at a digital preservation conference to delete things, right? We know this is really important. Okay?
The D word.
As soon as we start keeping stuff really carefully, we realize actually there's some stuff that we have to get rid of. So isn't that a deal breaker for DNA storage? I mean, does that not make it impractical from what you were describing there?
If Twister follow through on what they're saying, then it'll just be like tape storage. You click delete and that'll be deleted. In the background, it'll destroy the first copy and create a new copy without that data in there, but functionally it'll be the same if they follow through on that.
As long as you don't hand it to your patrons or your donors in a little capsule, that might be hard to delete.
It's a question of cost, right? Is the cost to modify higher, right, or is it cheaper to just rewrite the right archive? And then the other question is, of course, is what's your transfer chunk size? How do you want to organize your data, right? So let's say you use these capsules. What's your standard storage in a capsule like that? Or do you want to make it variable, right? Those are all the questions that then have ripple effects.
Yeah, I think I'm really curious. One of the things that I'm really curious about is how, like, a file system is represented in DNA, aside from, like, the infrastructure that Twist builds. Like, if you, 100 years from now, come across a capsule and you want to synthesize it, or I think that's the right term, I get them mixed up. Sequence, yes, thank you. You want to sequence it, how do you know, how do you determine file system structure, the context of the materials that are in there?
Yeah.
This is why the OAS architecture is very important, because it's self-described.
Yeah.
I can talk to it a little. We, for our pilot, we were only able to store one file. So we zipped up the 6 files and stored a zip file. My understanding in talking with Dan is that this is the kind of thing that DNA Storage Alliance is working on, like how to encode the data as DNA and potentially how to represent a file system in there. But I'm not sure. I'd love to hear about whether a file system can be represented or it's always just going to be one file.
Yeah, I'd be happy to take this. So there are a few ways. If you saw that capsule, it has a barcode on it, just like a tape drive has a barcode on it. And in your storage system, in the software, you index what each tape has. So you connect a barcode to content, then you know what you have on each capsule. On the question, what happens if you find this capsule after 100 years, this is a thing we are working on in the Alliance. We are trying to define what does a master boot record looks for DNA. So we have that on hard drive. So an operating system or a PC or a Mac gets the hard drive, knows where to go in the hard drive in order to start reading and loading the operating system. So we're doing the exact same thing on DNA. So you'll know a specific DNA sequence that will tell you which company created this, with which codec, what was the date, and maybe a small description of what's in it. And then this can take you a pointer to another table that can be like a file table if you're talking about a file system, or an object list if it's an object storage. So that's the way that we're tackling this one.
Thanks, Dan. I knew you'd be useful in the panel session as well. Any further thoughts, guys? Should we move on?
Good.
Okay. So there's lots more questions in the room and online, but we've still got quite a bit of time left. So I'm going to go back to one of our pre-prepared questions, and we'll come back to the audience soon. So we'll bring in a bit more of the context. So Euan was starting to hint at a few of these things in his presentation. In an increasingly uncertain world, do we need to reconceptualize our requirements for long-term preservation storage? And how does DNA storage force us to shift our thinking about some of the storage tenets we've long adhered to? Who wants to kick us off?
Well, I think we are back to tangible media, like paper. I mean, archivists are used to archive papers. Then we went to digital information, and now I think we are back to something tangible. We have to look after and to manage also with barcodes and capsules, these kind of things, like box. You have to put labels, these kind of things. So it's a new shift for archivists, I think.
Who else wants to come in?
So I'm not sure. Oh, well, it might be a new shift. It might not be, because I suspect to make the thing scale, you have to automate, and you have to have the equivalent of tape libraries and disk servers and everything else. So you go away from having physical media offline on shelves and back to media in libraries in machines that are online and networked and connected, and that's where we are right now. So I don't know whether it will change or not, really.
Yeah, I agree with that. After reviewing the criteria against what I've read on DNA storage, it actually struck me that the tenets of what we're doing still hold true, and we still do want this particular viewpoint, the viewpoint that we bring as preservationists, and it's still extremely helpful in that there really isn't a lot of shifting to be done, because we can find a way to incorporate it into our digital preservation strategy. It's just more right now the technology needs to grow and have standards and infrastructure built around it so that it actually becomes something that we can implement in our strategies.
Further thoughts?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. I think the one thing for sure that will change, and I would encourage everyone to think about that, is scale. So this is also why the SRC had, the Semiconductor Research Company, has concluded in the decadal plan that we need storage technologies that can support 10 to 100x the capacity of what we have in today's technologies. Again, augmenting what is there. So the question you should ask yourself, the data that you're handling today, the data that you have under management, if that data grows by 10x, by 100x, what breaks? So how you architect solutions, right? How you approach them, right? That's going to be key. For example, if you have a requirement to access your data in a specific amount of time, and your storage media has a certain read speed, right? Now, if the storage capacity is 10x, right, you may not meet your service level agreements anymore, right? So when you go and crawl through data as part of maintenance, right, how will that work when it's now 10x the amount of data, right? Because what comes further into challenge is that capacity is projected to grow faster than performance. And moving data every time comes along with energy, which costs money and creates sustainability issues, right? So these things we all have to think through of as we are projected to enter the yottabyte era at the end of this decade, right? As a global world population, right? What changes when we scale?
Further thoughts? Euan, do you want to come?
There are two new things that you might want to think about that kind of change the paradigm. That what happens if you can define what is the capacity of a storage device? Right now, you're faced with what the providers are giving you. Like you have a hard drive, which is 10 terabyte, 15, and 20, and then you try to fill it with as much information in order to make it usable. But what happens if, for example, the Sound and Vision Institute, they want to store a movie per capsule? So you are not limited by what the device is giving you. You can decide the capacity of your storage device. It makes you think differently on how you organize your data, by years, by movie, by whatever it is. That's one thing. The other thing is the approach that Euan is taking with emulation. This is also very interesting, because what happens if we take out the burden that you don't need to upgrade the hardware every few years? So it's only by software. So do you upgrade the file formats every few years because things are changing, or you take a different approach of emulation where you only add to your archive because you have a storage medium that does not expire? So these are a few things that can you need to question with this new type of storage medium, I think.
Any follow-ups on that?
One of the things that I've been thinking, and it goes along with what you were saying, is that representation information becomes extremely important. So you might have a movie, but you really need to know how to play back that movie. And especially since for some of the economic and political instability that Euan was mentioning in his discussion, there might not be the originating institution being able to be the one in control of the materials, and long term it might persist outside of that organization. And so it might be the case where we actually decide to keep the software along with the files that can be played back in that particular software, or reconsider including additional metadata more than we have done previously. I think in general we've been, except for the dedicated like software preservation network, et cetera, most folks who just have content haven't necessarily worried about also keeping the software that's created or plays back that content. But that might be something that we also want to include in the capsule, so at least we have additional mechanisms, hopefully ensuring its longevity.
Software has been mentioned to you, and so
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with all of that. Unsurprisingly, we are testing out another Write Once storage media, the Pickle film. And as part of that, we've put in a copy of all the emulation as a service infrastructure, source code, executable code, and all of the environments, so pre-configured computers we've already created, which is over 1,000, with lots of software already installed on them, and all the installation media. And that's going into the Arctic World Archive this week, I think. So people will be able to go there and grab that if they need it off of those films. And it's kind of a nice, it works well together with this DNA stuff as well, because that Pickle film you can put text into that's human readable. So we can put the instructions on how to decode the DNA into that. And then if someone wants to access anything that's in the DNA, they can go get that and they should be okay. That's the theory.
Let's go back to another online question.
Cool. So a practical question from a representative of Digital Archives Flanders. Will every digital preservation institution need to build a laboratory-like room to read out DNA in the future? And is there an advantage for the general public? So kind of a twofer there.
No, I think would be my answer to that. Yeah. It'll either be wrapped up in one of those servers or machines that you just plug into the network like anything else, or it will be in the cloud and you'll use it as a service.
That's right.
Either way, you won't have to worry about being a wet lab and all the biology stuff.
Yeah.
Let's take another question from the audience.
Hi, yeah, just really interested in the democratization of data that this potentially allows for, and human beings and other biological organisms as potential carriers of this. So I don't know the science, but if it's DNA, and perhaps those that are worried about COVID vaccines and RNA and the liver and replication and all sorts of things, hey, could we all become carriers of data?
I've always wanted to be able to grow my data on a plant, like on my windows.
Other questions?
I apologize if you've already covered this and I missed it, but is the technology a worm technology, or does reading out the DNA destroy the physical DNA in the process?
Today, the process is destructive, so you need to establish a copy before you read it if you want to keep the data. As you can imagine, the industry is working on finding means to have non-destructive read processes.
I can add that in our pilot, I think they read from the same capsule more than one time because the process got messed up a couple of times. But it was the same capsule, so they didn't need to take another copy or another one of the capsules and open that up. So there's certainly enough in there to read from it multiple times.
Yeah.
Other questions? Oh, it's right at the back.
Hi, Asbjørn Skyt, Danish National Archives. Thank you for the presentations and thank you for this discussion also. So I would like to ask about this idea that you do not need to do medium migration if you store using DNA. What I'm thinking about is this encoding specification that you're using. What if you update your encoding specification in the future? Would that not necessitate a medium migration of the data?
I think I spoke about this lack of need of migration because there is no obsolescence of the media. But yeah, for sure, if you want to, well, also maybe you need curation because the format you use in your DNA is obsolete. So you need to rewrite it. But normally, in terms of media, you don't need to migrate. Of course, if you change encoding, but I don't know why you would change encoding, because you have to have a choice at the very beginning. What is the encoding you want to use for hundreds of years, and this is also why the DNA Alliance you are working on this sector 0, because. Then from that information, you know who is who encoded it, or with what format, and normally you should not use another format. But every archivist institution could use its own encoding format. So you will need to have a table where you know which format it is, but I don't see the point to change in the course of archiving the format of encoding. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
If emulation plays out, then you don't have to, at least the file formats, for example. Physical media doesn't need migrating because it just lasts. I think there's some interesting challenges around security and encryption and whether that would need changing over time. So then you'd have to read it all back out, decrypt it, re-encrypt it, and write it back out again if you wanted to change encryption keys. So that's a bit of a grey area, maybe.
Thanks, guys. We're almost out of time. I have a very quick question for the audience. I hope that we've kind of answered this question today to a greater extent. But anyway, if DNA data storage has a role to play, how can we build the digital community's trust in it to encourage its adoption? What more do you guys need from us to convince you that we should be going this way?
Well, I was a little bit surprised seeing in the first presentation a reference to OAS, at least to a part of OAS, missing the data management and the preservation planning part. And so I think there wasn't talk about the metadata you need. While you were referring, we need to add extra metadata to understand it. So I think the preservation community will trust, or you ignore OAS and don't mention it because it had nothing to do with it, or you elaborate on it and show what really is needed. And I think you need to do that during the developments and not afterwards, like often happens with OAS.
I can share a little more about our pilot. We made 50 copies of the DNA, and we're planning to put them in multiple different storage locations on campus and reread them every period of time. We'll probably wait at least a couple of years, maybe do 5, 10, 20, that kind of thing, with the idea that we can report back to the community and hopefully have some data to share about the longevity. I mean, it seems obvious it'll last forever, but we should test it.
Okay, we're out of time, I think, so we've given our panellists a reasonably good grilling. I think we could have done better, but not too bad, so please, yeah, give them a round of applause.